Okay, so good morning, everybody. Sorry for the hassle with the computer, but we have to be all engineers now with these new methods, and we changed the class because we had issues with the technical equipment in room 36. I have no idea whether this will be confirmed also for Friday, but apparently they haven't been able to fix them. So last time we had a look at the basic some basic notions of European law. I will now go back to where we stopped. Okay. And we discussed the structures of the European Union, the institutions, very briefly, as well as the main sources of European law that we will be dealing with a particular focus on European directives and regulations. And we stopped just at the beginning of the Lamfalussy method, discussing the Lamfalussy method, that, as I told you last time, was a solution to counteract the difficulties and the rigidities of the traditional method of producing EU harmonized legislation. At the beginning of the year 2000, the Commission was a little bit disappointed by the slowness with which the process of European harmonization of European law in financial markets legislation was moving, and so they decided to adopt this new Lamfalussy method, which, as I told you on Friday, is based on, first of all, 2 EU law levels. The first is level 1, which is made up, or should be made up, of more principle-based legislation, without going too much, as far as possible, into technicalities, as far as possible, because financial law is very technical per se, but you can try and keep level 1 a little bit more subtle, more with a lighter touch, so that it moves through the very complex legislative process involving the Commission, the Parliament, more easily. So if you think of following this approach, level 1, what would you generally expect to find in level 1 in terms of sources of European law? Considering what we saw last time, you remember directives, regulations? No, the opposite, because if you remain on the principles, then directives are the natural place to have that sort of stuff. This does not mean that you cannot have a regulation at level 1, but this would be much sort of difficult to negotiate at a political level, because regulations are immediately effective in all member states, so they swipe off national law, and they require a higher level of political consent between member states. So you can have a regulation level 1, but it's not truly fitting into the original Lamfalussy scheme. But over time, I must say, especially after the financial crisis, so the legislation that we've enacted in the Union after 2008, 2009, basically, we see an increasing number of level 1 made of regulations. And sometimes you have, the EU legislator is creative. Sometimes you even have a level 1, which is composed of a directive and a regulation. So you find a sort of, it's like ingredients that are mixed, basically depending on the political agreement that is reached on a certain topic. For example, in investment services, you have a level 1, which is made of the directive and a regulation. And then you have level 2, which implements the directive and also certain provisions of the regulation. So the model has evolved over time in a more flexible and articulated way. Level 2 is instead, as we saw on Friday, the part which is delegated to the Commission. And this is where the true technicalities are handled. It's the Commission, which is it's a technocratic body. It doesn't have to follow the legislative procedure of the Commission and of the Parliament, so it works much faster. That prepares that actually adopts the implementing acts in level 2. So level 1 will give you a general rule in principle, and then we'll say the Commission will adopt measures to apply this principle. If you are a little bit active on social, if you have a LinkedIn, you may have seen, for example, that on Friday, there was a big piece of news coming up saying that the new regulatory standards for ESG finance are being put in place. And these are standards that will sort of regulate the way through which the disclosure of sustainability elements in financial products will need to be carried forward. And now, technically, this level 2 regulation is technically called technical standards. And when the Lamfalussy approach was adopted, they were distinguished between implementing and regulatory technical standards. The difference between these two kinds of technical standards is truly a headache. Most of the times it's incomprehensible, because in principle, implementing acts implement, so you have a rule which is then applied more specifically, more in details. Regulatory technical standards seem to add something to what the first level says. But I can tell you, forget about it. Just remember that in level 2, you have technical standards which are adopted by the Commission. Now, the Commission works in strict cooperation with the European supervisory authorities, which are 3, and they reflect the silos approach that we discussed on Friday. European financial markets legislation is structured, some say, unfortunately, it is still structured in 3 silos. Unfortunately, because the market is much more integrated than these 3 silos would sort of envisage. So you have banking legislation, capital markets, and insurance and pension funds. These are the 3 silos, and in each of these 3 silos of European law, you have a European authority which is competent in that field. And in banking, you have the EBA, European Banking Authority. In capital markets, you have ESMA, and in insurance and pension funds, you have EIOPA. Now, basically, you should think about these authorities as, in principle, basically regulators. So they sort of produce the draft technical standards. They elaborate the draft technical standards, which are then approved by the Commission. So they are rule makers, and then they produce a lot of soft law, and we will see in a few seconds what is soft law and how it works. But there are some exceptions, because of these 3 authorities, ESMA also has supervisory powers. So you start seeing the distinction in the European financial infrastructure of regulation and supervisor, the distinction between regulation and supervision and enforcement, which is obviously the byproduct of the constitutional traditions that we have, let alone the poor Baron de Montesquieu with his theory, l'esprit de loi, the distinction between the judiciary, the legislative and the executive. And also in the financial sector, we have this approach. We distinguish between regulation and supervision and enforcement. Regulation is in the hands of a, so to say, legislative body. For technical standards, this is the Commission, which carries out a regulatory function because it produces level 2 legislation. And the three authorities which sort of prepare the draft regulatory standards. But ESMA also has some specific supervisory powers that we will discuss during the course. Now, before we proceed with this topic on supervisors and agencies, let me complete the Lamfalussy structure, which has two other levels, level 3 and level 4. Now, level 3 comes after level 2 because it is the phase when EU law is implemented into national law and common criteria are set out for this implementation. As you might remember, on Friday I explained that directives must be transposed into national legislation. This takes place through different channels depending on the structure and the constitutional structure of each member state, but basically you need a national legislative provision that applies internally the directive. Now, directives on the one side are sometimes vague. They leave uncertainties, space for interpretation. They may even leave a lot of space for options and discretions by member states. So you may have a directive which says member states can choose option A or can choose option B. And unless you want to end up after the implementation with very different national legislations, which formally have implemented the same directive, but turn out to be concretely different, you need to do something in between. And this is level 3. This is level 3, which is made up of a huge networking activity by the three authorities that results in setting common standards, guidelines, convergence models in terms of regulation and application of European legislation, which is very, very, very important for the goal of reaching a sufficient level of harmonization in European law. When you have a regulation, instead, regulation is much more straightforward, but level 3 is nonetheless important, even if you do not have the need to implement regulation into national law, because it comes into force and it's applicable automatically. But the way with which a regulation is applied, it is interpreted, again, may be different from one member state to the other. Basically, we speak 27 different languages, as I told you on Friday. They're not truly 27 because the official languages of the community of the Union are less than 27, but we have 27 different legal systems. And so the way through which a legal provision is interpreted and then applied locally differs inevitably from one country to the other. And so in order to reduce these differences, even when you have a regulation, level 3 activity by the ESAs, European supervisory authorities, is very important. And depending on the siluses, this would be for banking, the EBA, capital markets for ESMA, it will be ESMA, and insurance and pension funds, it will be EIOPA. And then level 4 is enforcement by the European Commission and the member states. I must say that in our sector, enforcement by the European Commission is very rare, doesn't basically occur. It is more linked to macro-prudential policy issues, such as the ones that are being intensely debated during the pandemics, including the Recovery Fund and so on. So enforcement is basically left to member states But there are some exceptions. The most important that you will see during the course is when enforcement of national law resulting from the implementation of the directives is carried out by the European Central Bank. We will discuss this extensively. It's a huge sort of dystonic element in this picture, where law is applied by national law, which implements European directives, is applied by the member states and by their national judges or authorities, and that's a big exception. It's in the SSM regulation, it concerns banking supervision, and it's an exception to this general rule, enforcement by the European Central Bank of national law. Now, the structure of the European supervisors was actually the byproduct of this document that's very important. Okay. And it's the De La Rosière report. So you have two important reports or commissions that delivered reports to remember. The first is Lamfalussy, because that's the way that we've been working since the beginning of the new century, financial markets. And the second is the De La Rosière report. Once again, it's a report that comes out of a commission established by the European Commission after the financial crisis of 2008. And I want you just to understand and just bear in mind how this was done pretty quickly. Let me enlarge this. Yeah. If I may. Okay, so the report is February 2009, and the Commission was set up in November 2008, after the financial crisis actually very severely hit all the systems worldwide with the symbolic collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. Actually, the crisis had been going on since at least 2007 in the US, but you know, when Lehman collapsed, it was really an incredibly important historical moment. Something that sort of resembled on financial markets what happened when the Twin Towers were attacked in 2001, and the entire financial system at that point was under shock completely. Big markets became totally liquid, and we really had the impression that the entire system would collapse. All regulators rushed in some way to try and fix the system. One of the accusations that was moved vis-a-vis the system that we had in place was naturally that regulation proved to be insufficient, it did not prevent the crisis, and we needed to fix this regulation. Now, please bear in mind that this is something that regularly comes up. Every time you have a financial crisis in history, what you see after the financial crisis is some kind of legislative response. This is due to a combination of factors. On the one side, if you have a huge market failure, it is true that something in regulation or supervision did not work properly, so you can learn from your mistakes. The problem is that each crisis is different from the other, so you will never have the magical recipe that avoids market failures, generally speaking. The second reason, so there's one technical reason why you should fix the rules after a market failure. The second reason is that it's a political response to the crisis. Politicians and legislators don't want to be accused of being inactive and of not doing enough on their own side. And so throughout history, since the tulip crisis and bubble in 17th century Amsterdam, which is generally recognized as the first financial crisis, even if tulips are not financial products, but it has the dynamics of a financial bubble. And then the second one was the South Sea bubble in England in 1720, and then blah, 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 blah. We've had a lot of, every time you see legislation coming in, trying to sort of fix the system, producing new rules. And this is exactly what happened in Europe. The Commission sets up the De La Rosière team in November 2008, and this team works very, very quickly. In just 3 months, they deliver their report, February 2009. This is the composition of the group. I don't like these highlights. I have no idea why they are there. Okay. Probably during the during the conversion something went wrong. It's too small. Let me see if I can do something to make it more visible. Yeah, maybe this works better. Okay. So this is the report, and this is the composition of the De La Rosière group. Very important report, very, very important. And you see there's a whole range of topics. It's not very long. It's not very long, just 67 pages. Well, this is something interesting because you don't have to write the Bible or the Divine Comedy all the time. You can manage complex topics by being short enough, and it's based on, each topic has its own sort of short comment on what happened during the financial crisis. And let me pick up just one by chance. I just click down and see what, oh, that's what I wanted to, I didn't do this on purpose. This is exactly where I'm going to stop for a few minutes, but I'll go back on this. Page 58. So let's go back. For example, this topic, we're talking about, the transformation of the existing committees into European agencies, and this is what we'll be talking about. You have a recommendation. Recommendation 21, it talks about reforming the system of European regulation and supervision by setting up the 3 ESAs that we just talked about in the Lamfalussy context. But let's pick another page, for example, this one of the first ones. Let me see. Okay. Recommendation number 2. In the EU, a common definition of regulatory capital should be adopted, clarifying whether, and if so, which, hybrid instruments should be considered as Tier 1 capital. And this definition should be confirmed by the Basel Committee. And that's a recommendation. And it's striking to see that all of the recommendations of the De La Rosière group were taken up by the Commission and transformed into new legal provisions within the European Union. So I can say without hesitation that the De La Rosière report is the most influential work of a committee that's ever been seen across the world. Everything that we have now in place after the financial crisis, including the SSM mechanism, centralization of banking supervision in the hands of the ECB, the infrastructure of European supervisors, directives going from CRD4 to the capital requirements regulations, to MiFID, to the alternative investment, for everything that we have now comes from the De La Rosière report. So if I were Monsieur De La Rosière, I would be very proud of my work because I really changed the face of EU financial legislation. The Commission used this report as truly, you know, a list of to-do things. And they clicked on each topic as they moved ahead in their legislative initiatives, proposing to the Council to adopt new legislation implementing practically all the points of the De La Rosière report. Now, among these points, you find the one that we were talking about, which is the structure of the system of European financial supervision. This is a very important slide, because what we have now in place is sort of what comes up from this idea. During the financial crisis, there were big discussions as to the role of supervisors, which were deemed to have been insufficient, and reforms were called upon to improve the system of European financial supervision. The problem that we had at the time, and that we still have in part, is fragmentation. 28 member states, today 27, and each system, as I explained a few minutes ago, applies and enforces national law, including national law which implements European directives, and implements also European regulations. So enforcement and implementation is local. Supervision was at the time entirely in the hands of the member states. And do you have any idea? So 27 member states, at the time 28 member states, let's say. Do you have any idea of how many national supervisors that are in charge of carrying on this work of enforcement, implementation, application? How many national supervisors we had and we still have in Europe? 27 member states, 28 at the time. So what would you guess, more or less? Any idea?
One for each member state.
Yeah, that would make sense, absolutely. One for each member state. It would be a good approximation. Unfortunately, in most member states, we have more than one competent supervisor, and the figure, which was last calculated in a paper which is now a little bit old, but I think the situation hasn't changed much, a paper by Professor Wimmer, of 2001, counted almost 200 supervisors. It's a mess. How can you put 200 supervisors together and have a homogeneous enforcement of European law? For instance, in Italy, we have at least 7 supervisors that have competences in financial matters. We have the Bank of Italy, which is the supervisor on the banking industry, but also the prudential supervisor in the capital markets field. So it's basically competent for prudential supervisor. Then we have CONSOB, which is the Commission for the Control of the Stock Exchange, which is competent in terms of transparency, investor protection, and conduct of business rules. Then we have the Antitrust Authority, which has a very important role to play in the financial sector. And then we have a specific supervisor for pension funds, which is called COVIP, Commissione di Vigilanza sui Fondi Pensione. We have a supervisor which is specific for the insurance sector, which is IVAS, which is actually an internal body within the Bank of Italy, but it has its own autonomy, its own governing council. And then you shouldn't forget money laundering. It's a very sensitive topic for the financial, not just financial world. And this has its own supervisor, which again is an internal body, but segregated within the Bank of Italy. It's called UIF, Unità di Informazione Finanziaria. And then I would add, because of the increasing importance of fintech, especially, the Privacy Authority that handles GDPR and privacy issues, which are becoming sort of the cornerstone, one of the cornerstones of the fintech dimension of financial regulation. As finance becomes more and more digitalized, issues of privacy, fundamental rights protections, big data, and all that stuff are becoming of paramount importance for the financial industry. So even if the privacy authority is in charge of privacy, it has a huge impact on the financial industry. So that's what you have just in Italy. And then you have to look beyond your borders, and you end up with an increasingly high number of national supervisors. They may be organized on an industry-based line. For example, you have a supervisor for the banks, you have a supervisor for investment funds, for trading venues, or they may be organized in terms of functions, prudential supervision, vis-à-vis transparency and investor protection. This is left to national legislation. So in order to sort of try and have the system work better, the De La Rosière report imagined the creation of a new infrastructure for financial supervision. And it's divided into two levels. The top level is something that we won't really be concerned with. We won't talk about macroprudential supervision. It's obviously very important, as you can see also during these days, all the discussions revolving around the European Stability Mechanism, the Recovery Fund, and so on, revolve and affect that area. And that's basically a network of European institutions and agencies, which is made up of, on the one side, the ECB, the three ESAs, and the European Commission working together. You also have to link this with the international dimension, because macroeconomic policy has also that impact, especially in terms of the International Monetary Fund. But that's something that we won't really be concerned with. It's macroeconomic policy. What we'll be focusing on is the second level, which is macroprudential supervision. And you see that the two levels are linked. There are arrows going up and down, because if you have a big problem in macroprudential supervision, you have a huge bank that's failing or likely to fail, this has an impact on the macroeconomic level. And also the way through which macroprudential supervision is carried out has an impact on microprudential supervision. So you have to imagine that the two have to speak with each other. They cannot be separated. But the macroprudential supervision that the De La Rosière report is imagined is first of all articulated into three European agencies. And these three agencies they reflect the silos structure that we discussed on Friday: banking, capital markets, and insurance. And in each of these areas, you have a specific European agency. Over time, the name has changed. This was the first proposal of the De La Rosière group, but the structure is the same. The European Banking Authority hasn't changed. It's still called the European Banking Authority. It has changed its location, however, because after Brexit, it moved, as a consequence of Brexit, it moved from London to Paris. There were huge rows between the French and the German as to who should host the European Banking Authority. And naturally, these rows were not simply because Paris is much more beautiful than Frankfurt. I would live in Paris. I would have difficulties in living in Frankfurt with the same scenario that I have in Paris, but it was much more political, obviously. And ultimately, the decision was not to bring the EBA to Germany, because Germany already has the #1 European institution on financial topics, which is the European Central Bank. So the attempt was not to really focus everything in Germany, and so the EBA moved to Paris, where, by the way, the European Securities Authority was already based, ESMA. Was already based because before these three authorities were set up under the De La Rosière report, three committees existed for the three siluses, and in particular for the securities world, the committee that existed before its transformation into ESMA was based in Paris, and it was called CESR, CESR, Committee of European Securities Regulators. But these committees were more informal, so to say. They had no legal personality. They were like, a place of brainstorming and voluntary cooperation by European supervisors, among European supervisors. Now, the De La Rosière report takes up these committees and transforms them into European authorities, full-fledged, with a legal personality, with a structure, with a budget, and gives to these committees basically the most important task that they carry out are regulatory functions. So they perform regulatory functions in the context of level 2, providing guidances in the context of level 3. They also have additional functions, such as, for example, singling out cases where member states are in breach of European law, referring these to the Commission, so as to create a homogeneous application so as to foster the homogeneous application of European legislation. So this is the basic idea, is that these committees should have basically regulatory functions. The exception to this rule, however, turned out to be after the De La Rosière report was implemented, the committees were set up. This came at a later stage with subsequent legislation. The exception is ESMA, which actually changed. The name that was adopted is slightly different from the one suggested by De La Rosière, because they were thinking of European Securities Authority, but actually it was then called the European Securities and Markets Authority. So you have an M, ESMA, but that doesn't change much. And what happened is that ESMA has been entrusted, after its creation, with some supervisory powers as well. But this is very specific. It concerns only specific topics. For example, central depository and clearing houses, credit rating agencies. And credit rating agencies were one of the big topics discussed during the financial crisis, because they were not regulated, which seems a little bit crazy now, but in fact they were not regulated. So they could issue their judgments on ratings, which, as you know, are very sensitive for markets. The judgment of Standard & Poor's and whatever has a very high, but they were not regulated. So one of the suggestions of the De La Rosière report was, we have to supervise and regulate credit rating agencies in Europe, and ESMA was entrusted with the task of supervising credit rating agencies. So today, if you want to set up a credit rating agency in Europe, you have to request an authorization, and you will be subject to supervision by ESMA, directly at the European level. It's an exception to this scheme, because in this scheme, supervision is in the hands of national supervisors. But it's an interesting exception. We will see this more in details as we move along the course, because somebody thinks that this is the nutshell of what might become, in certain fields, the European supervisor in capital markets matters. It's still limited to a few topics, but it's interesting. The second exception to this structure is naturally the banking field, where in 2013 we had the adoption of the SSM regulation. The SSM regulation will probably pop out of your eyes by the end of this course, because we'll be talking all the time about the SSM. The acronym stands for Single Supervisory Mechanism, SSM, regulation adopted in 2013. and system in place since November 2014. It's an exception because in the banking field, banking supervision for countries, or rather for banks which are based in euro currency countries, so banking supervision for the euro area has been centralized to the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. It's an exception because if you see this slide, you see that banking supervision is national. But banking supervision is not national anymore. It is centralized in the European Central Bank's hands in Frankfurt, but this only works at the moment for euro area countries, which are 19 member states out of 27. Non-euro countries have the option of stepping into the SSM, but no non-euro country has done so as of today. Okay. So in Europe, you have a very complex system of banking supervision because you have to distinguish between euro and non-euro countries. The non-euro countries will follow their national system and national supervisors. The euro countries have centralized supervision in Europe, which works in a quite complex way. You will see this during the banking part of the course. What centralization means effectively in the SSM regulation requires clarification that I don't want to provide now because we have lessons on that later on. But at the same time, the entire European Union, made up of 27 member states, adopts the same rules because European directives, European regulations apply across all 27 members. But they are enforced differently for euro countries and non-euro countries. Okay? And each non-euro country then has its own national system of supervision where you can find 7, 5, 4, 3, 6 national supervisors. It's a headache. It's a headache, but it's just one of the many examples of union in diversity. That's sort of the motto of the European Union. But you can imagine keeping this thing together is complex. So this is one of the reasons why in this scheme you see a lot of arrows going all the way, because the effort is to have all of these levels, the top and the bottom, macro and micro, but also horizontal levels, cooperate and talk with each other, because that's the only way through which you can, in some way, prevent the risk of excessive fragmentation of the system. And this slide was cut and pasted to the Commission and then to the Council and the Parliament, and this is what has been done. And the De La Rosière report, in all aspects, works exactly in the same way. It's really a groundbreaking document that nobody really talks about, but it must be remembered because it's so important. Okay, so let's go back to our slides and basically level 3 and level 4 of the Lanfalussy approach, and these are concepts that we already saw. I already spoke about the way in which the Commission works in the new context. When it starts working on a new provision, it carries on impact assessment, consultation, according to the method of the so-called better regulation. There are open issues. Lanfalussy was conceived as a way to reduce the timing implied in producing new European legislation, but sometimes this multi-level system slows down the process instead of speeding it up. Maybe that's one of the reasons why, for example, in the banking sector, it's not really used. We go more straight to the point. The second is the level of detail and the choice of legal instruments between level 1 and level 2. What is effectively appropriate at level 1, a directive, a regulation? Should it be detailed? Should it be more principle-based? There are uncertainties every time, and the resulting effect that we have is that European legislation differs greatly from one topic to the other as to the allocation of rules between the different levels of the Landfellow C structure. You have topics where level 1 is very detailed, topics where it is not so detailed. But the tendency, however, over the past years, and I think that this tendency will increase, is to have level 1 more detailed, more made up of regulations than what the Landfellow C report imagined 20 years ago. We are clearly moving towards an era where level 1 is detailed, it's full of regulations, and this is one of the reasons why we're ending up with pieces of European legislation that in certain topics are more than 1,000 pages long. If you try and print the whole bulk of level 1 and level 2 legislation in MiFID, you end up by printing more than 1,000 pages. So please respect Amazonia, don't do that, because you would really print more than 1,000 pages. And it's not 1,000 pages in Arial 36, it's 1,000 pages in Arial 8. So the level of complexity is astonishing. Yeah, so the level of detail, and also the choice of directives and regulations. Okay, the Landfellow C and De La Rosière report are over. This is the difference between the ESAs and the European security and the European system of financial supervision. And this is a slide on the so-called Meroni doctrine. I told you that the ESAs have a quasi-regulatory function because they prepare the draft technical standards. But this is a little bit of a problem under the treaty, because the treaty, according to the Meroni case decided by the European Court of Justice in 1956, it's one of the groundbreaking cases of the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice. The Court of Justice said in this case that had nothing to do with financial markets. It was a case of antitrust. But the European Court of Justice said that agencies cannot exercise discretionary powers to adopt rules of general application. And after 50 years, 60, 70, this doctrine is basically unchanged. There have been, however, some significant evolutions, and this clarifies the limits within which the European agencies, the three ones that we now have, EBA, ESMA, and EIOPA, can effectively act. They must restrict their functions to strictly technical topics, because if they exercise discretion, and they imply sort of discretionary powers, this turns out to be incompatible with the treaty. And there is always a lot of discussion as to where this discretion ends or begins, because the boundary is not written in the stone. And sometimes you have the feeling that everything is okay, that what the ESAs are doing is a purely technical work that does not really imply any discretionality. Other times you feel that instead they have discretionality. And this issue was discussed in a case that you will be offered as a potential menu for the group discussions, which is the very famous recent short selling decision taken by the European Court of Justice. The Court of Justice was challenged by the UK government with the task of saying whether the wide discretionary powers that ESMA has in terms of short selling, in brackets, by the way, a very popular topic during these days after what you've seen happening and discussing on the social in relation to GameStop, close brackets. Under that regulation, ESMA has wide enforcement powers. And the UK said enforcement and discretionary powers because it can place bans on short selling regulations. And so the UK government said, wait, does this fit into the Meroni doctrine? Because what in fact the ESMA is doing is exercising discretionality. And the European Court of Justice came out with a leading case which said, yes, it's okay, with two effects. On the one side, upholding ESMA's position, but on the other side, if you read that decision, it's an evolution of the Meroni doctrine. It's an evolution of the Meroni doctrine. So something has changed. And this will be a case that you might be interested in discussing in the group presentation. And I think that we'll also have a paper as an individual assignment where you can look at this specific decision. Okay, so this is what I told you before. We have common rules, directives and regulations combined with implementing national legislation for all 27 member states. And in particular, in the banking context, in the banking silos, this is colloquially called the single rule book. The single rule book. It's made up of the two fundamental pieces of this single rulebook are the CRD4, now CRD5 directive. CRD stands for Capital Requirements Directive. We'll talk about that a lot. And then you have a lot of other pieces of legislation. And this applies throughout the entire European Union. But then you have within the euro area supervision, which is particular and specific to euro currency countries and only applies within the euro area. So you see, it's difficult to combine these two elements because you have common rules, but they're applied differently among different member states. Okay, so let me now show you a short video, which I think is interesting, on the history of, now we are gradually approaching banking legislation and the banking silos. So let me show you a short video on the history of the European Central Bank. I anticipate it's a little bit celebratory, but it's a video prepared by the European Central Bank, so you wouldn't expect these guys to be sort of, but in 7 minutes, it guides you through a phase of history that you didn't live simply because you were too young or not even born at the time. And let me see if it works. No, it doesn't. I have to go back. I hate Blackboard, by the way. Finally. In the slides, you have the link. Oh, wait a moment. If you can't hear well from home, for those of you who are connected, you have the link to the video in the slides. Or in any case, you can go to YouTube and search for the video, which is called "The History of the European Central Bank." It may be that in this room you have issues in listening to the audio while I show the video, okay?
After 2 world wars in less than a century, many people sought the means to prevent such devastation from happening again. One idea put forward by a French civil servant, Jean Monnet, and taken up by France's foreign minister at the time, Robert Schuman, was to pool the industries that were seen as the engines of war: coal and steel.
L'Europe ne se fera pas d'un coup, ni dans une construction d'ensemble. Elle se fera par des réalisations concrètes, créant d'abord une solidarité de fait.
In 1951, 6 countries, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, signed the Treaty of Paris, creating the European Coal and Steel Community, governed by the first supranational body, the High Authority. Europe's leaders wanted to go further, so on the 25th of March 1957, they signed the Treaties of Rome, creating the EEC, the European Economic Community, and Euratom, the European Atomic Energy Community. In 1968, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Pierre Werner, proposed a single currency. The Werner Report, published in 1970, called for step-by-step progress towards monetary union within 10 years. But a year later, the US devalued the dollar. Then there was an oil crisis and the Werner plan was shelved. So instead of a monetary union, some countries in Europe introduced what was called the currency snake, which set limits on exchange rate fluctuations, both against a number of European currencies and against the dollar. Between its creation in 1972 and its demise 7 years later, the snake saw a lot of exchange rate adjustments and a veritable revolving door of countries joining, leaving, and then rejoining again. In 1979, the push for economic and monetary union was revived. The European monetary system was born, and the European currency unit, or ECU, was created. The ECU, however, was only a virtual currency, a mere unit of account. Within the European monetary system, the member states agreed to keep their currencies within a fluctuation band of 2.25%, around a central reference rate. This was the start of the exchange rate mechanism. The governments of the member states didn't always find it easy. There were 37 currency realignments between 1979 and 1987. In 1986, the member states signed the Single European Act, which marked the first substantial changes to the Treaty of Rome. The objective of the Single Act was to create a true internal market by 1993, based on the free circulation of goods, people, services and capital, with no non-tariff barriers. In 1988, the then President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, was appointed to chair a committee whose findings were to become the basis of the Maastricht Treaty. The Delors report envisaged a 3-stage progression towards economic and monetary union. Stage 1 focused on increasing the cooperation among central banks and was adopted as of the 1st of July 1990, when the movement of capital in the European community was liberalized completely. The Treaty on European Union was then signed in Maastricht on the 7th of February 1992. It laid out the framework and the further steps for achieving economic and monetary union and making it work. The treaty established 1994 as the beginning of Stage 2. This phase would bring about economic convergence, as well as the institutions and procedures needed to achieve it. The treaty set out the convergence criteria which member states had to fulfill in order to be considered ready for the adoption of the single currency. Stage 2 saw the creation of the European Monetary Institute, which began its work in Frankfurt on the 1st of January 1994. The EMI carried out all the preparatory work necessary for the ECB to assume its responsibility for monetary policy. In May 1998, EU leaders and finance ministers met in Brussels to decide which states had reached a sufficient degree of convergence and could therefore participate in the monetary union. They also appointed the first president of the ECB, Willem Duisenberg, and the other members of the first executive board. The ECB was established on the 1st of June 1998, replacing the EMI and taking over its Frankfurt offices. Together with all the national central banks of the member states of the European Union, the ECB came to form the European system of central banks. On the night of the 31st of December 1998, the euro was born, and the conversion rates of the currencies participating in it became irrevocably fixed.
Dans chacune des monnaies nationales de l'Union.
Stage 3 began on the 1st of January 1999, when the single currency was launched and authority over monetary policy was transferred from national central banks to the Governing Council of the European Central Bank. 3 years later, on the 1st of January 2002, the new banknotes and coins were introduced amid widespread celebrations. People queued at cash dispensers to be among the first to have the new currency in their pockets. For 3 years, the euro had been the official currency for banks, businesses, and the financial markets. But now it belonged to everyone.
Okay, this is a little bit like Disney, but so that's naturally the first part of the story, because then, after the financial crisis, the ECB has been entrusted with banking supervision together with monetary policy. So it now has two functions: monetary policy, which is an exclusive competence of the European Central Bank, and banking supervision, which is structured, as we will see, and as I anticipated a few minutes ago. Okay, we were talking about the single rule book. The roots are in the De La Rosière report, as I explained. They proposed to accelerate the process of harmonization of European banking law, and basically that's what we have now in place. And this is a more detailed description, or rather a list of the things that EBA does under its quasi-regulatory powers. And there is a topic that we will see. You'll go back to these slides once we start discussing the SSM mechanism, because in some way, as an exception to the general rule, and in some areas, the ECB, the European Central Bank, is not just a supervisor, but also has regulatory functions. So I know you may be disappointed because you would like to have a black or white system, but in Europe, nothing is black or white. We have different shades of gray. So in principle, the EBA is the regulatory authority and the ECB is the supervisor. But there are some areas where the ECB carries on, also has regulatory functions. And this has been widely discussed, but you'll go back to this point. In this new structure of and system of financial supervision, I would like to single out the increasing importance of soft law, soft banking law, or rather soft law in general, because the increasing importance of soft law is something that you see not just in the banking sector, but also in capital markets and in the insurance sector as well. Does anybody know what soft law means or what soft law is? Have you ever met this expression? No. Well, basically, we use in different sectors. It's an expression that was born in international law, actually, rather than in financial markets law. But it's an expression that we use to identify a wide range of non-binding provisions which are issued by administrative authorities or supervisors. In our field of interest, we're talking about the ESAs, the European Central Bank, and national supervisors. And it's a body of guidelines, recommendations, opinions, Q&As, practical manuals, which are practical guides, which are constantly being produced. It's a huge bulk of sources that you find, which is not law technically. It is not binding technically. And it is becoming increasingly important, and we will see quite a number of examples of this soft law during the course. It is not formally a piece of legislation, so it is in principle impossible that this body of soft law is enforced in the way in which the law is enforced, for example, by issuing a sanction or an administrative measure against an entity that does not follow these guidelines or this soft law. But there are a couple of points that need to be pointed out. The first is that in some cases, especially when you look at guidelines which are prepared and issued by supervisors, including the ECB, these guidelines have in themselves a mechanism which is the comply or explain approach. The comply or explain, it's as if I were setting a standard for this class. For example, I think that you should turn down your phone during the class. Shut it down. I give you this guidance. I don't have the power to sanction you. I can't throw you out of the class. I can't open a disciplinary procedure. But I will say, if you keep your phone open, tell me. Now, if you're in a class made of 80 people, we are not so much now because of the situation we are living, and at a certain point, 80 people say, I comply, I'm shutting down my phone, you would have a strong social pressure to do the same. And this is what happens with the comply or explain principle. First of all, those guidelines come from a very reputable authority, which has a strong moral suasion, like I have in this class. If I want, I can have a strong moral suasion, because then I have a carrot and I have the stick, which is the final exam. So I can exercise undue pressure on you guys by forcing you de facto. Formally, I'm leaving you free to do whatever you want, but I'm forcing you de facto to follow my guidelines through the comply or explain mechanism. Now, the increasing size and volume and importance of this soft banking law is starting to create a little bit of problems, because we are not so sure anymore that it is purely optional, that it's purely a gentle nudge towards a certain direction. And there is now, quite surprisingly, I must say, a very important case in France because the highest French administrative court, which is the Conseil d'État, raised an issue in front of the European Court of Justice through the preliminary reference procedure. The preliminary reference procedure, as I think I told you on Friday, but sometimes I get confused because I have two classes, same topic, one after the other. So I'm not sure whether we discussed, probably not, because we had the technical issues of changing the class and we had less time on Friday. The preliminary procedure, reference procedure, is one of the most powerful tools that the European Court of Justice has in its mandate. And it works in this way. If you have a case in a country of the European Union, which is open in front of a court, and the solution of that case implies the application and interpretation of European law, and in principle, national courts must apply European law and interpret European law directly. But if they are uncertain as to how European law should be interpreted, they need to ask clarification. And who do they turn to? The treaty is very clear. The only institution who may interpret with a final word European law is the European Court of Justice. So it has a huge influence. And the French Conseil d'État is now asking to the European Court of Justice whether the guidelines issued by EBA in a certain area of banking law, which is product governance, may sound a little bit mysterious now, but by the end of the course you'll perfectly understand what product governance is. What are these guidelines? Are they mandatory, truly, in fact, or they are entirely optional? Because there's a discussion in France between a bank and the French supervisor where the bank had no actual intention of following those guidelines, and it raised the issue, said, why should I follow the guidelines if they're soft law? And the issue arrived on the table of the Conseil d'État, and the Conseil d'État is now asking the European Court of Justice. And this is a paramount case, of paramount importance, because what comes out of the European Court of Justice may radically shape the way in which we are thinking of soft law. It may be the end of soft law, or it may be the beginning of a new era of soft law. My impression is that the European Court of Justice will in fact say that this soft law is in some way binding, but it would have to justify that, because the tendency of the Court of Justice has been always to uphold rather than destroy the position of European supervisors and authorities in this respect. But we'll see what happens. It may also be that the Court of Justice says that they're completely not binding, and this will probably open up a new chapter in the way in which this soft law is used by supervisors. Okay, now let's have a short 7 minutes intermission with another video, because I'm now practically closing all the general concepts on European law, and we will directly delve into the technicalities of banking law with the second set of slides. But before I do so, I would like to show you this short presentation by Professor Paul Craig, who's one of the world leading experts in European law. And it's an interesting question. One of the things I would like to achieve in this course is not just to provide you with technicalities on what's the ECB, what's the EBA. This is the course, okay, but that's what I will do. But I would be more than happy if at the end of this course you would get out of this room with new eyes vis-a-vis the European legal dimension, so as to make you understand how important it is to look at EU law, not just because you're lawyers, because you are European citizens or you live in Europe. And this short video tries to answer some of these questions and opens up also new perspectives in terms of approaching EU law. So let's hear what Professor Craig has to tell us. It's also quite interesting to see that we hear these words from a UK scholar, but now the UK is not part of the European Union anymore. But in fact, UK universities strongly oppose Brexit, not just because Brexit has a tremendous economic impact on UK universities in terms of fees, students' enrollment, and so on, but also, I mean, conceptually. So let's hear his words.
Of Craig and de Berke on EU law, text cases and materials.
Sorry.
And we're just producing the new edition. When I first started teaching EU law, which was intake of breath, 1978, at that time EU law was a little bit adventurous. It was regarded a bit like international law, that is, an exceptional subject which a few practitioners knew about and nobody else really did. Things have changed really dramatically in the last 30 years. The reason why it's so important to study EU law now is there is almost no part of domestic law which is not affected in a fairly significant way by EU law. So whether you're thinking of tax law or social welfare law, whether you're thinking of the law of contract or commercial law, whether you're thinking of the law relating to trade and the movement of goods, whether you're thinking about competition law or company law or discrimination law, all these areas of law now have an EU component. In that sense, it's impossible to be a purely domestic lawyer. If such a creature existed, then they need to be put in the Ark or in a museum or something of that kind. It's not possible to be a purely domestic lawyer. Whatever your specialty is, you need to know something about EU law. So for a student, when you're going out there, if you want to practice law or know something about law in your later life, you have to know about EU law because it's the framework which produces the law relating to all of these different areas. Any student who comes to EU law for the first time will find a number of things that they have to get used to. They have to get used to the idea that there are a set of institutions out there at the EU level which are different from those in their nation state. They have different names: Commission, Council, European Parliament. And the division of powers between those institutions is not always as clear as it might be in some nation states, and that's something you have to get used to too. But that is something which students actually become accustomed to pretty quickly, because most of you out there are pretty bright, and therefore you're going to get used to this stuff pretty quickly. But equally, you have to get used to the fact that the European Court of Justice and the General Court have their own style of reasoning, their own way of framing decisions, and you have to get used to reading decisions given by the European courts, and the style of those decisions isn't actually quite the same as that given in domestic courts. A further difference which you'll get used to, and again it's something actually which is just something that most students get used to really quite quickly, is the fact that the legislation produced by the European communities, or the European Union as it now is often framed slightly differently from domestic statutes. So all of these things are just part of the learning curve when you take on this new subject. But don't worry about it, because you, the students, are actually going to get to are going to be able to grasp these issues rather more quickly than you might initially think. EU law is a very large subject, so at any one point in time, there are always multiple debates going on in EU law. And indeed, because EU law is a big topic, then you'll have debates going on between EU corporate lawyers, you'll have debates going on between EU environmental lawyers, you'll have debates going on between EU administrative lawyers, etc. Having said that, standing back from where we are now, I think that some of the major debates which are going on are these. On the one hand, you do have debates about what the implications of the Lisbon Treaty are going to be. How's the Lisbon Treaty going to affect the disposition of power, both between the EU institutions, as it were, at the EU level? The interinstitutional division of power is going to be affected by Lisbon in a number of ways. Precisely how it's going to be affected is still being worked out. So, for example, the balance of power between the European Council and the Commission, the balance of power between the Council and the European Council, these matters are being worked out and debated. Another issue which is being debated is the impact of the new provisions about competence on the vertical division of power between the EU and the member states. One of the aims behind these provisions on competence was to try and quiet member state fears about competence creep, about the fact that the competence of the EU seemed to be expanding with no real limitation. So the categories of competence were put there in order to try and make clearer when the EU could act, when it couldn't act, and therefore what the reserve powers of the member states were. There are debates going forward about the precise effectiveness of this new categorization of competence. Another debate, yet again, is going to be about the impact of folding the area of freedom, security, and justice into the main body of the treaty. This is going to be really quite dramatic, because there are many important provisions in these areas concerned with issues such as criminal law, criminal procedure, immigration, asylum, hot political topics where the law is difficult and the politics are even more difficult, if I can put it that way. And the impact of making these legal provisions fully justiciable, so that the European Court of Justice is going to have full authority over these areas. It's going to be big changes, and there are debates about precisely how those changes are going to fall out, what those changes are going to look like. One final example. After 10 years, the Charter of Rights at the EU level is now fully binding. Even before the Lisbon Treaty, the Charter was referred to increasingly by litigants, by advocates general, by the General Court, and equally even by the European Court of Justice. But Lisbon is significant. The Charter is now legally binding in its own right, has the same status as the treaties themselves. This is likely to have a significant implication for the kind of cases going before both the European Court of Justice and national courts. And there are big debates about the nature of those implications. In my view, it's going to lead to a fairly significant change in the kinds of cases being dealt with both before national courts and the European Court of Justice. So just to link the point I made just a moment ago about the AFSJ with the area of freedom, security, and justice with the Charter, if you put the two together, it's potentially quite explosive in the following sense. The area of freedom, security, and justice is now fully justiciable. Many of the legal provisions made in those areas, dealing with asylum, dealing with immigration, dealing with data protection, dealing with criminal law and criminal procedure, raise complex and controversial issues concerning human rights.
Okay, so this is interesting because it goes back to what we saw at the beginning when I told you that the European Union has progressively enlarged its scope, and it now deals with a lot of new topics, including fundamental rights and sort of stuff. So just to close today's lesson, do you think that protection of fundamental rights is a topic that is interesting for our course. Can you figure out cases, examples, where the protection of fundamental rights, such as personal freedom, ownership, are in some way topics discussed in financial regulation, or are these two separate words? As Professor Craig was recalling now, fundamental rights protection is part of EU law because there's a Charter of Fundamental, but is it relevant for our course or not? Any idea? Blank. Well, think about, for example, the development of fintech and the use of personal data in the fintech world. That's a huge topic. It touches upon fundamental rights protection because the way in which the data are used and processed by big market players in the fintech industry has an impact on personal freedom and personal data protection. Some suggestions from the chat, yeah, some way they make sense. Another area is sanctions. Supervisors enforce EU law and have very strong sanctionary powers. And these sanctions touch upon individual liberty and freedom. They include criminal sanctions. In some way, under EU law, you can have also criminal sanctions or sanctions which are formally not criminal, but in substance they are close to criminal sanctions because they limit your personal freedom. For example, they prohibit you from carrying on a certain professional activity for a certain number of years. And that's a second very sensitive area. Then there's the whole area of banking crisis and resolution. And you will see that in a resolution case, rights of creditors, of shareholders, of bondholders can be wiped out with one stroke of pen. If it is in the interest, if it is in the public interest to put a bank into resolution, you have the so-called, we'll talk about that, bail-in mechanism. And this sort of, annihilates creditors' rights and stakeholders' rights in banks. And this has an impact on fundamental rights. So it's all interconnected. And I would be happy if at the end of the course you would be left not just with a significant technical experience in financial markets, but also with a flow of interest as to these huge topics of European law that are in everybody's daily life. Okay, so it's everything for today, and the next 4 classes will be managed by Martina Scopsi, and so we'll see each other again the last Friday of February, and then I will be here until the end of the course, guiding you through the rest of the program. In the meantime, you'll have Blackboard updated with the list of topics for the group presentation and the list of the topics for the individual assignments. This will take place between, let's say, tomorrow or latest Wednesday. You'll have the full list, so you can start reasoning on that.